Well, as I just said, we are concluding the section that begins with this, on the surface, very strange, almost impossible verse. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds. Again, this is one of those verses that at least it looks like it's not hard to understand, but how in the world do you do that? And the reason we ask that is because we misunderstand it. And it looks like be happy when bad things happen. And that just makes no sense. Well, hopefully we've realized by going through this, that's not what God is asking. It does make no sense to try to be happy when bad things happen. But that's not what joy is. It doesn't say be happy. It says consider it pure joy. Make a determined decision to face this situation with an attitude. That's what joy is. It's not a feeling, not an emotion. It's an attitude. A frame of reference for acting. Here's how I am going to face everything here through this perspective, this attitude of joy. And we said that the joy, the best I can see as I read and put everything together, again, it's this attitude of confidence that God can be glorified in the midst of whatever the situation is. God can receive glory. We have confidence that He's in control and that He loves us, He's working for our best, and so we are confident God can receive glory, and that's our purpose, that's our why in life. From the time God created us and still now, it's to bring glory to God. And so that's what it's saying. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds. And we said that word trials, it can be translated trials, it can be translated temptations. It includes natural things that everyone encounters in their life, Christian or non-Christian, natural disasters, wars, recessions. It also includes persecution, specifically for being a Christian, and it does include temptation, temptation to sin, and that's where the focus was last week and this week. Well, so it's different than we thought, but as I looked at it today, it struck me, and maybe a little ironically, that, it does say consider it joy, not enjoy, but I do enjoy life most, long term really, when I resist temptations. These things we're talking about. Now, that's not to say temptations aren't enjoyable. That's the temptation of them. But long term, I realize, and I thought about it like in relationships. Lisa and I, it's like I enjoy the relationship more when I don't give in to the temptation to be selfish or get angry. And that's what I want. And it made me think of Psalm 37:4, where it says, take delight in the Lord, and He will give you the desires of your heart. And very often we focus on that last part first. Well, God's going to give me the desires of my heart. Well, it says when we take delight in God, and even then the desires of our heart, that's what's true deep down. It's the thing that will truly satisfy us versus all those desires that we get them and we realize something's still missing. And so the desire of my heart, those are things like that good relationship. I want that. And it says, that will come when you delight in the Lord, when He's your focus, when He's what you're living for, and to live for Him means you're living for and by His principles, and so it all comes back. Again, when I resist those temptations, wow, life really is more enjoyable even. And we've been saying that. I think we all want to resist temptations. At the very least, we want to avoid the results of giving in to temptation because it's not good. I'd like to be rid of that. And we've said that. Well, James is trying to help us here. He originally set it up and said, consider it pure joy. And then he says, if you lack the wisdom to do that, and we said wisdom, knowledge is knowing what I should do and want to do. I want to consider it pure joy when I face a trial. I want to grow, be more mature and complete, closer to God, bring Him glory. Wisdom is how. Here's this divine perspective from God that is so radically different from the world's perspective. It says, here's how to have the good life. Here's how to accomplish, and sometimes even Christian, quote-unquote, wisdom that's different from God's. It says, here's the way to please God, and it's not. God's wisdom. And James gives it to us. He says, if you lack it, God will give it to you. And then he gives us this example we saw last week with the poor Christian and the rich Christian. It was all about perspective. He says, you know what? If you're a humble believer, take pride in your high position. Poor people aren't thought of as being in high positions, but he's talking about your salvation. You have a spot in heaven reserved for you, and you have God with you right now. He says to the rich people, you know what? Take pride in your humble situations, your humiliation. What's that saying? It's like for everything you've got, it's not going to do you any good when it comes to living life in terms of you're going to die eventually. And what's ultimately eternally important is what you have with God. Take pride in the fact that what you have here isn't what's important. It's what you have in store and what you have with God right now. And so last week the wisdom was sort of from this idea of have a spiritual, eternal perspective instead of a physical, temporary perspective. Well, this is really part B of that. James is saying here's another bit of wisdom as you face temptation. And the wisdom here is mainly know the source of temptation. It'll help you know the nature of temptation, and that, again, will help you to face it successfully. And so let's look at these last verses in, again, this section comes to an end in verse 18. Let's see what these last verses say. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does He tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. Don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all He created. Again, we said it last week, and it's true this week. We can't resist temptation if we don't really understand it. If we have the wrong perspective, or today, if we view it coming from the wrong place, the wrong source. And so the question today that's going to frame everything we talk about is, who do I blame for being tempted? Who do I blame? When I'm tempted, what comes to mind? Well, this is why. Well, that's one, and that's on track. It's better than the first answer that we're going to see here. Because look what James says. He says, when tempted, and remember, this is the exact same Greek word for trials. And it's just like whatever the context indicates. So tempted, trials, is the same thing. Those natural things that everyone encounters, persecution as Christians or temptation to sin. When tempted, and notice when, it's going to happen, not if. No one should say, and the Greek there can be translated possibly stop saying. Like James, and you remember the situation here. James was the head of the church in Jerusalem, and the Jews began persecuting the Jewish Christians, and they fled. And so he's writing to these Jewish Christians that have been scattered abroad and are being persecuted, and he knows them. You know, he cares about them, but he also knows what's going on. He's probably heard back from some, and so maybe he knows you guys are doing this. So stop saying, when you're tempted, stop saying, God is tempting me. Now, I thought about it, and I've interacted with a lot of people since being in ministry for however many years. I don't hear many people say, God is tempting me. Just come out and say, why is God tempting me? Maybe every once in a while. But you know what I do hear, and it can be present when someone says, why God? Why is God doing this? And even, why is God allowing this? There's an element there of, you know what, the situation is causing temptation. God is causing or allowing the temptation. And so there's that implied element of, why is God tempting me? And definitely after a person sins, it can come up. From the very beginning, the first sin, what did Adam say to God? This woman that you gave me. Wouldn't have had this temptation, wouldn't have sinned if you hadn't given me the woman. Exactly. Wouldn't have a lot of other things if you hadn't given me the woman, and I'm not complaining about that, but this one here I'm complaining about. No, see, we can do that, can't we? After we sin, we come out, oh boy, it's this, and even if it's not directly God, especially for a Christian that believes, God's in control. If He doesn't cause everything, He certainly allows it. So there's that implied element. God, why are you tempting me? James says, don't do that. When you are tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me. For God cannot be tempted by evil. We're going to see below this, temptation begins with evil desire. That there's a situation that we encounter, and our own desire, our evil, sinful desire, is what leads to the temptation. Well, God doesn't have evil desire. So whatever situation He encounters, He's never tempted to sin, because it doesn't have that key ingredient you have to start with. God can't be tempted to sin. This is what we talk about when we say God is holy. If you were to do the family feud and, okay, we surveyed people, top 5 answers, God is, probably love will be up there number 1, but holy's got to come in there. God is holy. Holy is the Lord. Well, what's it mean that God is holy? Again, I said it several times. I hope you remember, holy literally means, it means separate from. Literally, it means cut off. Cut off from, separate. And when it's used of other things other than God, it's separate from the world and set apart to God. And in the Bible, in the Old Testament, they had holy spoons and forks and perfume recipes that no one is to use this in normal everyday life. It's separate from the world, set apart to God. We as people are to be separate from the world, set apart to God. Well, what's it mean about God? It means He's separate from sin. God is separate. It's so separate. One, He cannot sin Himself. And then the other side of that doesn't come into this context, but we mentioned it, the whole Christian context, the whole, matter of fact, from Adam and Eve and the promise on to Jesus, is part of being separate from sin is God can't allow sin to go unpunished. You see someone beating a child, and you can't just stand there and say, well, it's not me doing it. You're complicit if you allow that to happen and do nothing, at least call 911, something. God can't allow sin to go unpunished. That's part of His holiness too. So that's what it means God's holy. He's separate from sin. God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does He tempt anyone. Well, think about it. Tempting someone to sin would be a sin. Trying to get someone to sin would be a sin. So God can't sin. It means He can't tempt anyone to sin. He can't. It's absolutely contrary to His nature. Now, it might bring to mind the fact that, yes, trials can lead to temptation. I'm in the middle of a difficult situation, and it can tempt me to be discouraged, to be angry, to be dissatisfied. It can do all of that, and God does test us through trials. God does allow trials at the very least, maybe even cause them at times. But the difference is, trials can result in perseverance, and that's God's intention. Trials can result in the kind of growth that God knows we need. That's His intention for allowing or maybe even causing. And again, the fact that there's nothing that God doesn't allow, and we have to reconcile that. Well, why, the question might come, well, God, why do you allow it for me and not for someone else? Why do you allow it for this person I'm close to and not for someone else? Why'd you do that, God? And one answer is, again, we live in a fallen world. God's original intention for the world was never to include sin and the effects of sin. And it's real now. It's why God warned them. It's why He warns us. It happens. It's real. Our sin, other sin. This is the world we live in. And then there's one side of it where we just have to, when it all comes down to it, say, I don't know why God allowed it. And I hate to resort to that answer because I feel some people use it too quickly. Well, I just don't know, but I'm definite it's true. Like, no, you need some evidence. But here's one where we don't know why God allows some things. God's God and we're not. Why did He allow it here and not there? We don't know. We know it comes from being in a fallen world. We don't know exactly why He allows one thing and not the other. But God never allows anything with the intention of causing us to sin. He allows things with the intention of causing us to turn to Him more and more and overcome whatever sins we have, whatever issues and problems, and grow in a certain way. God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does He tempt anyone. Well, then what is the true source of temptation? He tells us in verse 14, but each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. I like the English Standard Translation better. I think it does a better job. Instead of dragged away, it says, but each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Because it's a fishing metaphor here. And fish aren't dragged away unless you're taking the whole net thing. It's the idea of the bait. The fish is in his safe, secure place, and what's a fisherman do? He throws the bait close to there to lure them and entice them. That's what we're talking about here. The situation is the lure, and our own evil desire responds. Something in that fish says, I want that. It's his natural desire. Well, this is our sinful desire. We see a situation, and something in us says, I want to respond to that in a sinful way. Maybe it's something where potentially, we could get angry or not, could lust or not, all those things. Something in me says, here's how I want to respond. And we've been there. I want to, but I know I shouldn't. That's what it is. The situation plus our evil desire. Now, what's it mean that as Christians we have evil desires? The Bible says that as Christians we're a new creation. We have a new nature. That's all true, and what that means is we have a chance to say no that we didn't have before. And a lot of it, one, God does something in us, and another is part of our perspective. Again, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Before, we didn't even have a mindset. I see a situation to get angry, why not? I see a situation to lust, why not? I've got no frame of reference that says don't do it. Now I do. And now God's working in me to change that and stop that. It says in Ephesians 4:24 that our old nature, though, our evil desires are still present. It says, you were taught with regard to your former way of life, again, before you were a Christian, to put off your old self, which is being corrupted by its deceitful desires, to be made new in the attitude of your minds, and to put on the new self, created to be like God in true righteousness and holiness. Again, we were told to put off. Our old nature is no longer what guides us. Before it was us. We were putting on, and it guided everything we did. That's not true anymore. We put off the old nature. We're putting on the new nature. But here's the thing, that old nature is still present. It's not. You're never going to get completely gone of the idea of, here's how I could respond to that situation. And there's a part of me that wants to. And it even says in here that, our old nature is still being corrupted by its deceitful desires. It's not just I have to resist everything I knew before I was a Christian, however long that was. Satan's still working on that old nature. He's making it even more difficult for me to resist that. Like, okay, this one didn't get you, let me try this. So that battle is still going on. We can resist it, but it's always going to be a battle, is what it's talking about here. And so when James says each person is tempted when when he is lured and enticed by his own desire, that's what he's saying. We see these situations in that part of us that it's not controlling us anymore, but it's still there, and it's still whispering in our ear, hey, here's how you can respond. That's where it starts. And then he switches metaphors to a birth metaphor. Verse 15, he says, then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. Our will is tempted to give in to that evil desire. We have said before, we consist of our mind, our heart, and our will. Our mind is what we understand about the world, about, in a situation. It's our worldview. If I don't believe there's a God, I'm going to have an entirely different mindset than if I do. Now, I've come to believe there's a God, and so my heart is what I'm committed to, my general direction in life, what I really want to do down deep. And I always use the diet metaphor here. I come to realize that, being overweight, not exercising isn't healthy. Wow, no one told me that before, but now I know it. That's my mindset, and so my heart says, that's what I really want to do. I want to eat well, I want to exercise. But then there's that will part of us that actually makes the decision, and sometimes it follows that new heart based on our mind. Okay, I'm going to eat well, and I'm going to exercise, but every once in a while our will says, nah, not this time. I'm not getting up. I'm not resisting the Oreo. I'm not eating the broccoli. Whatever it is, it doesn't always correspond, but at least it gives us the general ability to. Again, our mind has changed, our heart has changed, but sometimes our will goes contrary to that. It gives in to the evil desire, and when our will gives in to that desire, that is what sin is. You see the difference there? The situation plus the evil desire, that is what leads to temptation. And when we make the wrong choice, that's what sin is. It says, then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. Now, I read that, and here's the thing. Sin immediately gives birth to eternal death. The very first time you sin, doesn't matter what it is. You eat the cookie mom said not to, she asked you, you say, no, I didn't eat it. You're going to hell at that point. I'm like, wow. But it goes back to God being holy. God can not only not sin, He can have nothing He can't overlook sin. And it's not just He can overlook 1 or 2 or 10 or 12. He's absolutely holy. He can't overlook any. At that point, if that was the first sin of our life, at that point, we are eternally separated from God. That's our eternal destination and what will befall us. But it says here, when sin is full grown, it gives birth to death. And so I'm not sure why, what's the full grown side? Is he just using that metaphor of birth and full grown? The other side of it might be that he's talking about spiritual death there. Again, the first time we sin, we are eternally guilty. But as we continue to sin and that sin becomes full grown, that's when we become spiritually sinful. When, again, that sinful nature becomes stronger and more and bigger, and it just changes everything about us, including the way we look at life. That gives birth to that spiritual death. And again, when we become a believer, we're instantly forgiven. There is no guilt whatsoever, but it takes a lifetime to deal with the spiritual consequences of our sin that's happened there. So God does not tempt us. Again, temptations arise when our evil desires encounter a situation. There's the situation. My desire says, I know I shouldn't, but I'd like to respond this way. That's what temptation is. Again, when our will gives into it, that's what sin is. And so realize that means situations themselves do not tempt us. Think about that. Situations do not tempt us. You know, if someone gets cut off in traffic, not every person responds by honking the horn and waving a finger. They're like, whatever. Glad it's him driving recklessly, not me. It's the situation, the exact same one that another person gets angry at. Someone does. So you can't say, oh, it's the situation. No. It's what's in me, how it responds. You know, lust. There's a beautiful woman there. Some people are going to lust, some don't. Doesn't mean, see, the situation, different people respond differently. It's not the situation. It's what's in me. And that's why the whole focus of this today, I need to understand what's in me. Can't control the situations. To some degree, I can avoid certain things, look certain ways, not know certain things that make me angry. Okay, get off the phone with AT&T. That's a story in itself. I can avoid those situations, but again, there's going to be situations I really need, and what James is talking about, know what's inside of you, your desires that are leading to that temptation, because it takes both of those, the situation and your desire. That's what leads to temptation. That's what results in temptation. And so he says about that, don't be deceived, my dear brothers and sisters. Again, these people that he cares greatly about, he knows personally, he's hearing what's happening, he knows they're being persecuted, he knows Satan's using that. He says, don't be deceived. Deceived about what? To think, oh, it's just the situation. There's nothing I can do. This situation tempted me. No. And certainly not God tempted me, because really, again, as Christians, when we say the situation tempted me, and like, God, if you hadn't allowed that driver to cut in front of me, I wouldn't have said that. We never come out and say it, but boy, it's your fault, God. That's what it equals as Christians if we believe God's in control. It says, don't be deceived about the source of temptation. And notice he doesn't say don't be mistaken. Because, you know, if you thought that, maybe that was an eye-opening, maybe that was an aha moment this morning when I said, you know, situations don't tempt us. And when I explained, you know, certain people, you're like, oh, okay, I get that. So maybe prior to that, you were mistaken. But notice he doesn't just say don't be mistaken. He says don't be deceived. It's not just a matter of you understand it incorrectly. There's someone actively trying to deceive you so that you understand it incorrectly. Ephesians 6:11, Paul says, put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. Notice he doesn't just say attacks. You know, it's not just a battle where one side's here, you know, the old Revolutionary War. You got the people lined up here with their muskets and the people lined up here. All right, let's all just shoot until there's no one left standing on one side. That's a battle. Can't even imagine that, but that's how they did it. That's what he's not talking. He's talking about the schemes, the strategies, the way he tries to sneak around and get there and knows, well, here's your weakness. I'm going to come that way. I'm not just going to stand out there and attack you. That's stupid. Satan knew more than they did back then. But he does use schemes, and that's what he's talking about. He tries to deceive us. Now, why would Satan want to deceive us in this way? Well, because the effect of God is tempting me versus truly knowing the nature of temptation is it's going to be impossible to overcome. How are we going to overcome it if we don't understand it at all? Again, the whole point is the what that I'm trying to do is to resist temptation. The how is to have a different perspective and to understand its source and to understand my role in it. Well, if we don't understand the how, there's no way we're going to accomplish the what? Resist temptation. Because I don't know how to do it. I'm going about it the wrong way. Think, oh, it's that situation's fault. And really, it even undermines, you know, we've said at the center of things, you have what, you have how, but at the center is why. And it really undermines the why, because why do I want to give glory to a God who's tempting me to sin? If that's what I ultimately think, even if I don't realize it, I'm blaming situations, why would I want to glorify a God who's making it harder for me to glorify Him? So we need to understand, not be deceived. Satan wants us to deceive, and potentially, again, to the point of death. It says, when after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, gives birth to death. That's only true the first time we sin. It's true as a believer if we totally just reject God. That's what Paul said. I looked at it last week, but it fits here as well. 1 Thessalonians 3:5. Paul says, "For this reason, when I could stand it no longer, I sent to find out about your faith. I was afraid that in some way the tempter had tempted you," just what we're talking about here, "and that our labors might have been in vain." Again, what were their labors? Teaching, preaching, introducing them to the gospel and giving them the chance of salvation. And so in vain means we were there, and some of you accepted it, but Satan, through his temptations, there's the possibility, Paul knows, that it will all have been in vain, that you will abandon it, that you will lose the commitment that you had. He said, I came to check about your faith. And we've said, again, faith, it's that fuller. It's not just I believe in my mind there's a God, but I'm committed to Him. I rely upon Him, surrender to Him. I'm committed. And we've said over and over, all the way since Matthew, our commitment doesn't have to be perfect, but it does have to be total. We can't just say, God, I'll be committed to you in every area, but not this one. I think of people, in one area where it definitely comes up. I think of people that, Christians that, by and large, you look at their life, it's a good, godly life, but there's one area, and one area it often is it's sex. They have a relationship, and they know that's wrong, but, I'm giving God, I'm committed to Him in so many other areas. You can't have one area that's off the table. That I absolutely am not going to even try to listen to you in this area, God, whether it's that or any other area. And Satan's going to try to deceive us however he can, through temptations, through whatever, to think, it's okay. Paul knew that. That's what he was so worried. He said, I had to find out. I couldn't stand it. I had to find out what's going on there because I know what can happen. Again, temptations and trials we've seen all through this passage, they have the potential to strengthen our faith, to help us become more mature and complete, but they also have the potential to totally undermine our commitment. And we have to realize if we're going to resist this and fight this and know what we're doing, Satan is behind this. Satan, that one of the most powerful beings God has created, is opposing us. And his goal is that we will undermine our faith and commitment because he knows what's at stake. At the very least, the closeness of our relationship, God, and ultimately he knows he can get people to totally abandon God and maybe not even know it, abandon some area of commitment and think it must be okay, and it's not. Again, salvation is not based on the number of works we do. Don't ever think that. It's not, I'm at 75% and I have to be at 80, or 74 and I have to be at 75. God's not up there doing that. And you know what? If He was, quite honestly, I use those numbers like that. If we truly grasp God's holiness, we'd be saying, you know what? I'm at 3% compared to God, every second of the day compared to God's holiness. But the whole point, He's not looking at that scale, but He is saying, do you have faith or not? That commitment element or not? Even that doesn't have to be perfect, but it's got to be total. That's what God looks at. And so Satan is trying to undermine that. And now that doesn't mean, what's the classic thing we hear when someone sins regarding Satan? The devil made me do it. Yeah. Doesn't mean he made us do it, but it does mean he's certainly helping any way he can. It's ultimately our choice, but he's trying. So temptation is not from God. That's why James is saying, don't be deceived. Matter of fact, just the opposite. Look what he says in verse 17. Every good and perfect gift is from God, from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights. Again, the potential error and deception is God is tempting me. He is giving temptation. And James says, no, He doesn't give temptation. God gives every good and perfect gift. That's what He gives. And what's that mean, every good and perfect gift? Again, if it's just on our own, we're like, well, God, I'd like this, this, and this. James says you give it. I think in this context, the immediate context, it's certainly anything good comes from God. But in this context, he just talked about the humble believer and the rich believer. I think he's saying, you know what? God gives gifts that are way better than what the humble believer is lacking and the rich believer has. And he gives things that go so far beyond those material, physical things. And then, of course, his ultimate good and perfect gift is the new birth that James brings up in verse 18. He chose to give us this spiritual birth. He chose to provide the opportunity for salvation. That's God's good and perfect gift. Comes down from every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. Does not change. Whenever you talk about something not changing, you have to have a point of reference, don't you? If you've been to our house a while ago, we had our furniture one way, and maybe you've seen it since it changed. Have we changed our furniture? Well, it depends on what you mean. Since we did initially a few months ago, or, since the time we moved in. Yeah, we've changed it since then. It's where the point of reference is. Well, what's the point of reference for God? He doesn't change. You go all the way back to creation. God doesn't change from the very first time we see Him, which is in creation. And what does creation show us about God? It shows us He's pretty powerful. To be able to create out of nothing. He's in absolute control. And why did He create? Because He loves us. He wants to have a relationship with us. So that's what we saw first off. Wow, those things just keep coming up. He's in control and He loves us. Creation showed that. And then what further things do we see about God that shows He doesn't change? Well, we see His providence. It's what we've seen as we've been going through Genesis. It's like, wow, God, you love us so much that even when we screwed up, and not just Adam, but we all have, you said, I still love you. I'm going to work things out. And we've just seen over and over. It's like, it'd be tough enough for God to work out His plan if every person along the way had said, God, let me help you work out. I want to help you. Because we're not perfect. But the people weren't saying that. They were doing all these wild things to screw up, and God's still able to see it through. He's still in control, and He still loves us. And what's He trying to bring about through all that? Well, that leads right into verse 18. God doesn't change like shifting shadows. He's been the same, and His purpose has always been, verse 18, He chose to give us birth. Not talking about physical birth, obviously. It's talking about spiritual birth here. It's talking about redemption. Jesus dying on the cross. Everything we see about God shows He's in control and He loves us. That doesn't change. It will never change. God doesn't tempt you to sin. Just the very opposite. He gives you good and perfect gifts, and that's the way He always is and always will be. That's what God is like. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth. Tell you what, I saw that, and I don't know how often you hear it. I come across it, I have for years, and I still every once in a while. You'll come across this phrase, either exactly or in some form, we're saved by Jesus, not by doctrine. And usually it's in response, and I understand there has to be a balance. It's not like God's going to administer some theology test, and if you don't score high enough, you're out. We're not saved by doctrine in that sense, but we are saved by truth, and that's what doctrine is. What is true and what is not? People who say we're saved by Jesus, if you ask them, who's Jesus? Well, He's the Son of God. That's doctrine. There are people who don't believe He's the Son of God. Well, of course He is. We're saved by the word of truth, it says. To be saved, you have to believe, and you have to commit to this God. Well, who's going to commit to a God if you don't know the truth about who He is, that He is in control and He loves us and He sent His Son to die for us? Those are essential truths. We're not just saved by Jesus apart from doctrine. You don't know Jesus apart from doctrine. So there's a balance there, but never, ever give in to that. And certainly the growth that follows our initial salvation, how's that come about? Through the word of truth, through reading this Bible and saying, wow, it's true that grace is like this, and I should live like this. It's true that I can consider it pure joy when I realize what the truth is. It's not be happy. It's realize I can grow and mature and persevere in my faith. All that stuff. He gave us new birth through the word of truth that we might be a kind of first fruits of all He created. First fruits goes back to the Old Testament. They would give of the first fruits of their crops to God. That would be their offering to Him. And for us, what James is saying there, it seems to be, he's talking to these early believers. It's one of the early books written. He's saying, you know what, you're the first of many to be Christians, God's new creation here. Well, again, our goal through all of this is to resist temptation and to have that life that doesn't have the results that come from when I give into it. And this passage gives wisdom, but we've said over and over, you're not wise until you apply it. You can be knowledgeable and not use your knowledge. You can't be wise and not live by wisdom. So what do we need to do? And realize, again, this is part B of last week, so wisdom includes that perspective also. So the first thing we need to do is put the temptation into perspective. When I'm facing a temptation, when I know there's one, again, and this helps, think about it ahead of time or think about it after I've given in, I've failed. Examine that and put the temptation in perspective. Ask yourself, what will I lose spiritually versus gain physically? What will I lose spiritually and eternally versus gain physically and temporarily? Because that's really what the choice is coming down to. The situations there, our evil desire says, hey, I'd like to react this way, and our mind knows that's not what God says to do. All right, put it in perspective. If I give in, what will I lose spiritually? And it might not just be eternally. What will I lose right now spiritually? That relationship with the Christ-likeness I'm striving for, the maturity, the completeness. What's this going to do to me in that sense if I give in? Versus what do I get? If I give in, what's going to happen? When I face this situation, stop and consider, if I give in to this evil desire, what will I lose spiritually? And again, it may be eternally. It may even just be now. Right now, I want to have closeness to God right now. I want to be like Christ. I want to be mature and complete. What's that going to do to my maturity, my completeness, if I give in? My Christ-likeness that I'm striving toward. To be conformed to His image, as 2 Corinthians says. Versus, if I give in, what do I get? And be honest. Okay, I get this, and it's sort of nice, sort of fun for a while. But boy, long term, what's it costing me? What am I giving up? What am I losing there? Think about that. Apply it to our situation. Second, what evil desire does the temptation appeal to? That's what we saw today. Basically, question 1 is last week. Question 2 is this week. What evil desire does the temptation appeal to? Again, whether we attribute it to God or not, I don't hear many people saying, God is tempting me. But often we fail to see our evil desire behind it. Because that's what James is saying. It's not God, it's your evil desire. Well, okay, I might not say God's tempting me, but I don't just come out and say, oh, it's my evil desire in play here. And we come up with something else. We're tempted to get mad and not forgive. Well, they deserve it. Nothing evil about that. They deserve it. Who would? You ask anyone. How's that work? The wisdom of the world, they'll tell you. I'm tempted to lust. Well, it's just natural. I'm a guy, come on. Not my evil desire. Greed, well, it's not as bad as stealing. Okay. Discouragement. I thought about this one today. It's not just doing those things, to be discouraged. Discouragement is a sin. And we have to, well, that one's just so easy to fall into. That's not fair. Again, when we realize God's holiness, we realize, we're not even at 70 or 80%. We're down at, lucky if we're 7 or 8%. Discouragement's a sin. But again, we think it's just natural. Who wouldn't get discouraged when this is happening to them, God? And we don't even think about our evil desires, but stop and examine it. Stop and think beforehand, afterhand. Again, it's difficult right there in the situation, but if you prepare yourself beforehand, it's easier. It'll come back to mind. What evil, selfish desire does each of these situations appeal to? Again, that person cuts me off in traffic. Okay, not everyone gets mad. What is it in me that is tempting me, that is leading to temptation, the situation, my desire, to sin, to get mad? What is it? It's like my desire for control. I don't like to be shown up. Like he's saying he's better than me, strong, and this guy, I'm not going to let it happen. What is it? And put it in that, and then 1 and 2 work together. Put that in perspective. Okay, what do I gain if I get mad versus what do I lose? I think about lust. Okay, what is it inside me that says, that's the way I want to act? Well, okay, that one's pretty obvious. What's it worth, really? Greed, discouragement. There's one. Again, what is it in me? And it's that part of me that, just looks at the immediate situation that maybe thinks I deserve something else. I never get discouraged if I get better than I expected, right? Well, I'm so discouraged. I expected to get $10 and I got 20. No, it's always I expected something and it doesn't. Well, what right did I have to expect a certain thing? What was I basing that on? Had God promised, here's what you're going to get? No, I just sort of come up with, here's what I think I deserve. And it didn't go that way. I'm discouraged. Again, we live in a fallen world. So put the temptation in perspective. What evil desire does the temptation appeal to? Third, remember what's at stake. Again, it's said this a couple times. Verse 12, blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love Him. Well, again, the opposite implication is it's possible to so give in to temptation and undermine our commitment that we don't receive the crown of life. And again, this is not to take away from our assurance in Christ that, oh, I'm at whatever percent. No, but it's saying temptation can lead there. Satan rarely gets someone from full commitment to God to absolute none, but he gets them a little bit at a time, a little temptation here, whatever it is, to do this, to be discouraged. That's where it can lead to. He says then in verse 15, then after desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it's full grown, gives birth to death. That's what's possible. Realize what's at stake eternally. Don't be afraid, but realize, again, don't see how close to the edge I can get. I'm not going to fall over the cliff 1 foot away. I'm not going to fall over the cliff 9 inches away. I'm not going to fall over the cliff 3 inches. Okay, but why do you keep getting closer? You know what? You're going to fall over the cliff at some point if you keep going. Why see how close we can get? And definitely, if our eternal fate, it never comes into play, that's never, we never fall over the cliff. What is it at stake? Remember, number 4, who's at stake? Not just what, but remember who. We're talking about God here and our relationship. It says in verse 17, every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all He created. That's saying this is the God who's offered to have a relationship with you. He doesn't tempt you. He gives you good and perfect gifts. He has ever since the beginning. It's His nature. Look anywhere you see it. See Him, you'll see that. Don't for a minute, don't in any situation give up any of the closeness that you can have with that God. That's what we want. So again, the goal. I need to apply this wisdom that James has been talking about to the temptations that I face. The conflict, whenever there's a goal, there's always a conflict, or we would have achieved it, right? The conflict is, it's more comfortable, it's more in line with my old sin nature to focus on the situation. The situation, that's the problem here. I keep giving in. This is so difficult, this situation. No. Even to say in some sense or imply God's responsible versus me. That's the conflict. I'm just so used to it, I don't want to change. The root problem, though, we've heard it today. What's the root problem? That we aren't going to just walk out of here and it be instantly fixed? I think that's not knowing God well enough. As weird as that might sound, I've been in church all this time, if we really knew God well enough, wouldn't we want to do everything we could to be as close as possible? If I really knew Him and everything possible, that goes back to what James said. If you want to face this trial, including temptations, if you lack wisdom on how to do it, you have to ask God and He'll give it to you. But what's He say? You have to ask in faith without any doubting. And we looked at that. It says, ask with commitment, without any judging and fighting, and saying, God, you give me your wisdom on how to live close to you. And if I think it's worth it, if it's not giving up too much, if it's not sacrificing something I don't want to sacrifice, I'll follow your wisdom. Well, again, the root problem is we don't know God well enough to say, God, whatever your wisdom is, I will do anything it takes to be closer to you. Because that's the most important thing in the world. There's nothing I could put off the table because it's more important than you are. To do that, we have to know God. We have to know Him, again, to become closer, and again, not just eternally, but to be closer to God right now. And when I say closer to God, it doesn't mean He's up in heaven withholding His relationship to us. It's just the very nature of a relationship, isn't it? I mean, if you absolutely refuse to be relationable with someone, you can't complain, oh, this relationship's so bad. It's not that person's fault. Again, it's not God up in heaven saying, I won't be close to you until you shape up. It's like, I really can't. If we're not seeing the world the same way, we're not close. We need to do that. Again, and we need to get to the point where we realize there is nothing worth jeopardizing that. So the key to overcoming, if we don't know God well enough, let's keep getting to know God. Isn't that what worship is? You know, it's not just declaring God's worth, it's knowing God's worth. And that comes through His Word, comes through situations when we see Him act in our lives, and it comes as we talk with other Christians and we see these aha moments of, yeah, you're right. Oh, yeah, I see that. Oh, please encourage me. I know it, but I'm having trouble. That's how we come to know who God is. So as we close, what do we need to do now? I think the thing we've been saying, we have to truly examine our greatest temptations and apply God's wisdom, the stuff we've seen for the past few weeks. We can't just, however we've been going about it before, trying harder, that doesn't work. Thinking it's the situation's fault, that doesn't work. I have to truly apply this wisdom of God's. And so as we close today, I guess the thought is, as we start to live it out, what is that wisdom? Does anything come to your mind of, here's what this brought out, here's how I can face, and you can be as specific as you want about the temptation, the trial, but if you've got some aha moment, this is part of the growth triangle. Let's talk about it.